The air in Aura was not meant for breathing. It was meant to be appraised, like a vintage wine. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, thick with the scent of old money, white truffles, and the subtle, almost imperceptible fragrance of power. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings not like light fixtures, but like frozen constellations, their refracted light catching on the diamond cuffs and pearl necklaces of the patrons below. The sound was a muted symphony of wealth, the delicate clinking of silver cutlery against hand-painted porcelain, the low murmur of conversations about stock portfolios and European acquisitions, the ghost of a footstep from a server gliding across the Italian marble floors. This was more than a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for the titans of industry, a golden temple where deals worth more than entire nations were sealed over plates of meticulously crafted art. Every detail, from the thread count of the linen tablecloths to the precise temperature of the water in the crystal glasses, was engineered to create an environment of frictionless, absolute control for the men and women who believed they controlled the world. It was a place designed to make its inhabitants feel like gods, and to render everyone else completely and utterly invisible. Within the gleaming stainless steel heart of this temple, Elara Vance moved with a practiced, economical grace that bordered on invisibility. The kitchen was a world of controlled chaos, a ballet of searing flames, sharp knives, and shouted orders, but Elara was its silent center. Her white cook's uniform, a stark contrast to the bespoke suits in the dining room, was clean but worn, a testament to the 70-hour workweeks she endured. Her movements were fluid and precise, a lifetime of culinary passion now compressed into the repetitive motions of a line cook. As she meticulously arranged microgreens on a plate of seared scallops, her focus was absolute. She was a ghost in the machine, a pair of skilled hands detached from a name or a face. The heat of the stoves was a familiar companion, the constant pressure a dull ache in her bones. She worked not for accolades or recognition, but for the paycheck that would be electronically deposited into her account every other Friday, a sum that felt impossibly small against the mountain of debt that defined her existence. She was a prodigy in exile, her brilliant mind and once limitless future confined to this small, sweltering space, serving people who would never know her name. As she worked, her mind was 1,000 miles away, in a quiet, sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and despair. The image of her father was seared onto the inside of her eyelids, a constant, silent presence. She didn't see the man who had taught her how to distinguish between 5 different types of basil by scent alone, the man whose laughter once filled their family home. She saw the shell he had become after the stroke, his vibrant eyes now clouded with confusion, his strong hands, which had once built a beloved artisanal food company from the ground up, now lying limp on a white hospital blanket. Vance & Company. Provisions. The name was a phantom limb, an ache of a life that had been stolen from them. The hostile takeover, orchestrated with the cold, surgical precision of a corporate predator, had not just bankrupted them, it had shattered them. The stress had broken her father's body and spirit, leaving Elara with a debt of over $200,000 in medical bills and a burning, hollow space in her chest where her dreams used to be. Every plate she assembled, every hour she stood on her feet until her back screamed in protest, was an offering to his care, a small payment against an impossible ledger. This life was a cruel irony, for the knowledge trapped inside Elara's mind was worth more than every dish served at Aura that night. As her hands expertly drizzled a rare, single-origin olive oil over a dish, her brain automatically deconstructed it. She could taste the specific terroir of the Andalusian soil it came from, the subtle notes of green tomato and almond, the precise phenolic compounds that gave it its peppery finish. She knew its history, the family that had pressed the olives for generations, the chemical composition of the rare saffron she was about to use. It was a savant-like understanding of gastronomy, a deep, academic-level knowledge of food chemistry and history that had once made her the star of the Culinary Institute of America. Her professors had spoken of her future in hushed, reverent tones. Now this profound expertise, this secret weapon, was useless. It was a language no one in her world spoke, a treasure buried under the crushing weight of her reality. She served her knowledge, diced and plated, to people who would praise its taste without ever comprehending the universe of science and history contained in a single bite. The delicate balance of the dining room shifted, a subtle ripple in the fabric of power that only the staff could truly feel. The maître d', a man who could stare down foreign dignitaries without flinching, seemed to shrink by an inch. His posture became rigid, his professional smile tightening at the edges. Alistair Finch had arrived. He did not simply enter the room, he conquered it. His suit was a dark, tailored armor of Italian wool that probably cost more than Alara's annual salary. His shoes, polished to a mirror's shine, made no sound on the marble, yet his presence was deafening. He was followed by a younger, nervous-looking associate, a man who seemed to be orbiting Finch's immense gravitational pull. Finch's eyes, the color of cold steel, swept across the room with an air of profound boredom, as if he were surveying a property he already owned. He didn't look at people, he looked through them, his gaze dismissing waiters, patrons, and the priceless art on the walls with equal indifference. He was the apex predator in this ecosystem of wealth, and his very presence was a declaration that the temple was now his. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. At his prime table, Finch performed his ritual of dominance. He waved away the sommelier with a flick of his wrist, dismissing a man with 30 years of experience as if he were a bothersome fly. He critiqued the wine list with a loud, carrying voice, using French terms with a slightly flawed accent, just enough to signal his supposed worldliness to his partner. Then came the main course, a specialty of the house, a saffron risotto with seared langoustines. The dish was a masterpiece of color and aroma, the vibrant gold of the rice, a testament to the precious spice within. Finch took a single, deliberate bite. He did not savor it. He analyzed it, his jaw working slowly. A look of theatrical disappointment clouded his features. He set his silver fork down with a soft, deliberate click that echoed in the suddenly quiet space around his table. He had found a flaw, not in the food, but in the world, and he was ready to correct it. He raised a single manicured finger, and the maitre d' materialized at his side instantly. Finch's voice was not loud, but it cut through the dining room's gentle hum like a shard of glass. He claimed, with the unshakable confidence of a man who has never been told he is wrong, that the saffron was a fraud. He declared it a cheap counterfeit, an insult to his palate and his intelligence. He used complex culinary terms, speaking of the lack of specific saffronol and picrocrosin notes, the telltale signs of authentic Crocus sativus from the plains of Castile-La Mancha. He demanded to see the chef responsible for this culinary crime. The head chef, a man with a formidable reputation, knew better than to challenge Alistair Finch. He was a major investor in the restaurant group. Intimidated and unwilling to face the billionaire's wrath, he made a calculated decision. He would sacrifice a pawn. He turned to the kitchen and called Alara's name. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she wiped her hands on her apron and walked from the familiar heat of the kitchen into the cold, silent judgment of the dining room. She stood before the table, a stark figure in her simple cook's whites, facing a titan in his tailored suit. Alistair Finch looked at her, and in his eyes she saw nothing. No recognition, no empathy, just the cold, flat appraisal of an object that had displeased him. He saw a line cook, an uneducated laborer, a nobody. He smirked, a cruel, self-satisfied twist of his lips, and began his lecture. He condescended, he explained, he pontificated, his voice dripping with disdain as he deconstructed the dish in front of her. using his shallow, memorized knowledge to tear apart the work of her hands. He was enjoying the performance, relishing the power he held over this young woman, this anonymous servant. As his arrogant words washed over her, the opulent dining room dissolved, and a single, sharp image flooded Ilara's mind. Her father, lying in his hospital bed, the beeping of the machines the only sound in the room. A cold, quiet fury began to solidify in her veins, a strength she hadn't felt in years. The ghost of her past was standing right in front of her, wearing a different name, and he had no idea the war he was about to start. For a long moment, Ilara remained perfectly still, a statue carved from silence amidst the opulent theater of the dining room. Finch's words, sharp and poisoned, did not land as insults, but as echoes of a past she could never escape. They swirled in the air with the scent of truffle oil and entitlement, but in her mind, they mixed with the sterile, chemical smell of a hospital corridor. The billionaire's smug, condescending face began to blur, replaced by the ghost of another visage. Her father's, slack-jawed and vacant in the aftermath of the stroke that had stolen his voice, his memory, his very essence. Each syllable Finch uttered was a fresh turn of the screw, a reminder of the brutal, impersonal force that had crushed their lives, a force that had a face, a name, a tailored suit. A profound and terrible clarity washed over her, chilling the sweat on her brow and slowing the frantic beat of her heart to a steady, rhythmic drum. The anger that rose was not hot and explosive. It was a glacier, immense and unstoppable, freezing her fear and solidifying her spine into something unbreakable. The years of swallowing her pride, of burying her intellect beneath a cook's uniform, of smiling politely at the whims of the wealthy, it all coalesced into a single point of pure, unadulterated resolve. The change was imperceptible at first, a subtle shift in the atmosphere around the table. The maitre d', standing a respectful distance away, felt it as a sudden drop in temperature. Ilara's shoulders, which had been slightly hunched in a posture of professional deference, straightened. She drew in a breath, not a gasp of shock or a sigh of defeat, but a slow, measured inhalation that seemed to draw all the ambient sound of the room into her lungs. Her gaze, which had been fixed on a point somewhere on the white linen tablecloth, lifted. She looked directly at Alistair Finch, and for the first time she was not looking at a customer or a powerful man. She was looking at a specimen, a subject of academic curiosity, a problem to be dissected and solved. The fear that had been a constant, low hum in her life for years simply vanished, replaced by an unnerving calm. The invisible line cook was gone. In her place stood Ilara Vance, the prodigy, the scholar of gastronomy, and she was about to give a lecture of her own. The nervous associate next to Finch shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing a tectonic shift in power that his boss, blinded by his own reflection in the polished silverware, was utterly oblivious to. Alistair Finch, however, was still deep in his performance, basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. He mistook her silence for intimidation, her stillness for surrender. He leaned back in his chair, a magnanimous king, explaining the laws of the universe to a simple peasant. He was about to deliver his final, crushing pronouncement on the matter, when a voice, clear and quiet but carrying the resonant authority of absolute certainty, cut through his monologue. It was Ilara's. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Every head at the nearby tables turned, drawn by the sheer, unexpected confidence in her tone. The sound was so out of place in the carefully orchestrated symphony of the dining room that it was like a single, perfect note from a cello interrupting a chorus of whispers. She had let him build his entire argument, brick by arrogant brick, and now she was preparing to remove the cornerstone with surgical precision, letting the entire edifice of his ego crumble into dust. The air grew thick with anticipation, a silent, collective holding of breath as the entire room, sensing the impending collision, focused on the cook in the simple white uniform. Her first words were not a defense but a correction, delivered with the dispassionate air of a professor addressing a promising but misguided student. She began by acknowledging his observation about the flavor profile, validating his palate just enough to draw him in, to make him believe she was agreeing with him. She spoke of the initial floral notes, the delicate bitterness on the finish. Then, the pivot came. It was swift, clean, and devastating. She explained that the notes he had misidentified as being absent were, in fact, present, but that they could only be detected by a palate not overwhelmed by the high tannins of the specific Cabernet Sauvignon he had insisted on pairing with the dish, a pairing any first-year sommelier would have advised against. A faint gasp came from the sommelier standing near the service station. Ilara's voice never wavered as she began to deconstruct not just the dish, but Finch himself, layering her argument with a density of fact that was impenetrable. She was no longer talking about a meal. She was conducting a scientific inquiry, and Alistair Finch was the variable being proven false. She moved seamlessly from viticulture to organic chemistry, her language becoming more technical, more precise with every sentence. She explained the specific chemical markers of authentic Crocus sativus harvested from the arid plains of Castilla-La Mancha, Spain. She spoke of picrocrosin, the compound responsible for the bitter taste, and saffronol, the volatile oil that gives saffron its distinct aroma. She described how their delicate balance could be subtly altered by atmospheric humidity and soil pH, factors that varied slightly from one harvest season to the next. She was painting a picture of a universe so complex and nuanced that Finch's binary judgment of real or fake was rendered laughably simplistic, the crude assessment of a child in a world of quantum physics. Her knowledge was not a collection of memorized trivia. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of information that she navigated with effortless grace, leaving Finch and his associate utterly lost in her wake. The associate's pen, which had been poised to take notes on his boss's wisdom, now lay forgotten beside his untouched water glass. The final blow was delivered with the calm, irrefutable finality of a judge passing sentence. She referenced by name a peer-reviewed study published in the 2018 edition of the Journal of Food Science and Agricultural Chemistry. She cited the lead researcher, Dr. Anya Sharma, and the study's focus on the spectroscopic analysis of saffron isotopes from that specific region of Spain. She concluded by stating that the very batch of saffron used in his risotto had been part of that study's control group, certified as 100% pure and representing the highest grade available on the global market. She knew this because her family's company, before it was destroyed, had been one of the primary ethical importers of that exact saffron, a spice she had personally analyzed in her university lab. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy vacuum, devoid of the clinking of glasses or the murmur of conversation. In that moment, Ilara Vance had not just defended a plate of food. She had reclaimed her stolen intellect, her buried expertise, and her voice. She had exposed Alistair Finch's entire persona as a fragile, hollow performance, and she had done it on his own stage, in front of his own audience. Alistair Finch's face was a mask of disbelief. The confident, condescending smirk had vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed emptiness. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen under the golden light of the chandeliers. For a man whose entire existence was built on the projection of infallible authority, this public dismantling was more than an embarrassment. It was an existential threat. He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a line cook, but an adversary. The color rushed back into his face in a furious, mottled tide of crimson. His eyes, once cold and dismissive, now burned with a venomous, personal hatred. The humiliation, witnessed by his associate and the surrounding patrons, was a wound he could not tolerate. He was a cornered animal, and he would lash out with the only weapon he had left, the brute force of his immense wealth and influence. His carefully constructed world had been fractured by a nobody, and he would not rest until he had ground her into dust for her insolence. His recovery was almost instantaneous, the shock replaced by a cold reptilian fury. He did not attempt to argue with her facts. He knew he was outmatched. Instead, he simply changed the rules of the game. He slowly, deliberately, reached into the pocket of his tailored jacket and produced his phone. With a few sharp, angry taps of his thumb, he made a call. He didn't even bother to lower his voice. He spoke directly to the restaurant's owner, a man he referred to by his first name with a familiarity that was both a boast and a threat. The conversation was brutally short. Finch did not shout or plead. He issued a command. He stated that the cook who had insulted him was to be removed from the premises immediately, or he would not only pull his considerable investment from the restaurant group, but would also launch a media campaign so destructive it would shutter every one of their establishments within 6 months. It was a display of raw, unrestrained power, a reminder to everyone in the room that facts and expertise were irrelevant in a world governed by money. The maître d' approached the table, his face ashen. The head chef emerged from the kitchen, his expression a mixture of fear and shame. He avoided Ilara's eyes, mumbling an apology that was lost in the suffocating silence. He told her to gather her things, that her employment was terminated, effective immediately. There was no discussion, no severance, no final paycheck. She was simply erased. As 2 security guards, who seemed to materialize out of nowhere, moved to flank her, Ilara felt a strange sense of detachment. She had expected this. She had known the moment she chose to speak that this would be the outcome. There was no regret, no fear, only a quiet, resolute acceptance. She had traded her job for a moment of truth, and in her heart, she knew she had made the right choice. The walk back through the kitchen was a gauntlet of averted gazes and sympathetic whispers from her former colleagues. They understood the injustice, but they also understood the brutal calculus of survival in this world. As she was being escorted towards a back service exit, a figure blocked her path. It was Alistair Finch. He had followed her, needing to have the final word to reassert his dominance. He stood so close she could smell the expensive, cloying scent of his cologne, a fragrance designed to announce his presence long after he had left a room. His face was twisted into a sneer of triumph, his eyes glittering with malice. He leaned in, his voice a low, vicious snarl meant only for her. He told her to remember her place. He said that people like her, insignificant, disposable cogs in the machine, did not get to challenge people like him, the architects of the world. It was not just a threat, it was a statement of his core philosophy, the cruel creed by which he lived. He believed in a natural order, a hierarchy, where he sat at the apex and she languished at the bottom, and her defiance was a violation of that sacred order. He expected her to flinch, to cry, to show some sign of defeat, but Ilara simply met his gaze, her expression unreadable, her silence a wall he could not breach. She was led out into the cold, damp air of a back alley, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind her with a sound of grim finality. The alley smelled of garbage and stale grease, a stark, nauseating contrast to the perfumed air of the dining room. For a moment she stood there, the city's distant sirens her only company, the reality of her situation washing over her. She had no job, no income, and a mountain of medical debt that grew larger with each passing day. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, threatened to pull her under. She thought of her father, of the next payment for his care facility, of the crushing weight of her responsibilities. The brief, fiery moment of victory inside the restaurant now felt like a foolish, reckless indulgence. What had she accomplished? She had spoken truth to power, and power had swatted her away like an insect, leaving her broken and alone in a dark alley. The cold of the pavement seeped through the thin soles of her worn work shoes, a physical reminder of her new, precarious reality. She made her way to the staff locker room to collect her few belongings, a worn copy of a culinary textbook, a faded photograph of her parents in happier times, and her street clothes. The room was empty, the metallic clang of her locker door echoing in the silence. As she was changing out of her cook's whites, she heard voices from the adjoining manager's office. The door was slightly ajar. It was the maitre d', speaking in a hushed, frantic tone on the phone, likely doing damage control with another VIP guest. He was confirming the details of the incident, and in doing so, he spoke the name that would change everything. He confirmed the reservation name, spelling it out for clarity. Alistair Finch, of Finch Global Holdings. The name struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. Finch Global. The words echoed in the deepest, most wounded corners of her memory. A name synonymous with ruin, with loss, with the slow, agonizing destruction of everything she had ever loved. Her blood ran cold. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. It couldn't be. It was a name she had tried to burn from her mind, the corporate entity that had appeared in the fine print of the legal documents that had dismembered her family's legacy. Finch Global was the private equity firm that had initiated the hostile takeover of Vance & Company. Provisions. They were the ones who had engineered the smear campaign, flooding the market with false rumors about supply chain issues and financial instability. They were the ones who had driven down the stock price until it was ripe for a predatory acquisition. It was not just a random billionaire who had humiliated her tonight. It was him, the architect of her family's downfall, the man responsible for the stroke that had silenced her father. The ghost that had haunted every waking moment of her life for the past 3 years was no longer a faceless corporation. He was a man who critiqued saffron and wore Italian suits. A wave of nausea and incandescent rage washed over her, so powerful it made her dizzy. The world tilted on its axis. The random, cruel act of a powerful man was suddenly reframed into something far more sinister and personal. This was not a new wound. It was the twisting of a knife in an old one. The condescending lecture, the public humiliation, the casual destruction of her job. It was all part of a pattern, the continuation of a war he had started years ago, a war he didn't even know he was still fighting. He had destroyed her family's business and walked away without a scratch, without even remembering their name, and then, by a cruel twist of fate, he had stumbled into her life again, just to kick her while she was down. The sheer, cosmic injustice of it all stole her breath, but it did not break her. Instead, it forged her despair into something new, something hard and sharp, a purpose. She walked out of the restaurant and into the sprawling, indifferent landscape of New York City. The towering skyscrapers, once symbols of aspiration, now looked like colossal, predatory beasts. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red as she walked, her mind a maelstrom of shock, grief, and a slowly kindling fire. The weight of her father's medical bills, the exhaustion, the hopelessness. It was all still there, but it was now secondary to a new, singular focus. The fight was no longer about survival, it was about justice. Finch's parting words echoed in her mind. Remember your place. She would. Her place was not in the back alley of a restaurant. Her place was not as a silent victim. Her place was as the daughter of the man he had ruined, the one person left who knew the truth and had the intellect to prove it. The prodigy he had dismissed as a line cook was about to become his worst nightmare. She did not go home to her small, cramped apartment to weep. The time for tears was over. Instead, she walked for hours, letting the city's rhythm match the furious pace of her thoughts. A plan began to form, hazy at first, then sharpening into focus with each step she took. She knew she couldn't fight him alone. He was a titan, shielded by layers of lawyers, wealth, and public relations experts. But she had a weapon he knew nothing about, her mind. And she had a truth he had long since buried. She thought back to her days at the Culinary Institute, to the professors who had believed in her, who had been devastated when she'd been forced to drop out. There was one in particular, Professor Albright, a man who had left academia to become one of the most respected and feared investigative food industry journalists in the country. He had been her mentor, a man who taught her that food was not just about taste, but about ethics, economics, and power. He had always told her she had a brilliant mind for seeing the systems behind the ingredients. Reaching her apartment just before dawn, the city outside beginning to stir, she felt no exhaustion. The adrenaline of her newfound purpose coursed through her veins, a more potent stimulant than any coffee. She sat down at her small, cluttered desk, the photograph of her smiling parents looking back at her. For years, it had been a painful reminder of what she had lost. Tonight, it was a declaration of war. She looked at her father's proud, happy face in the picture, and she made a silent vow. She would not let his legacy be a footnote in the biography of a corporate monster. She would not let Alistair Finch get away with it. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady, her resolve absolute. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't called in years. She took one last, deep breath, the cold rage now honed to a fine, sharp point. She pressed the call button, listening to the phone ring, each tone a hammer blow, forging the first link in a chain of events that would ultimately lead to Alistair Finch's ruin. The fight had begun. The phone call to Professor Albright felt like reaching across a chasm of time, back to a life that was no longer hers. His voice, when he answered, was exactly as she remembered, a low, gravelly timbre that sounded like it was filtered through old books and strong black coffee. He listened without interruption as Alara recounted the night's events, her own voice a low, steady monotone that betrayed none of the seismic shifts happening within her. She detailed the saffron, Finch's arrogance, the public deconstruction, and the final, brutal revelation of his identity. She laid out the story not as a plea for sympathy, but as a presentation of facts, a case study in corporate malfeasance that had finally found its human face. The years of academic training she had been forced to abandon came rushing back, her mind automatically organizing the narrative into a logical, compelling argument. She was not a fired line cook seeking help. She was a researcher presenting her thesis, and the subject was the systematic destruction of her family by the man on the other end of the story. She spoke of Finch Global, of Vance and Company, Provisions, of the carefully orchestrated lies that had poisoned their reputation and broken her father's health. As she finished, a profound silence stretched across the line, a quiet so deep she could hear the faint hum of her own refrigerator, a sound that suddenly seemed to represent the mundane, difficult life she was desperate to transcend. Professor Albright's office was a sanctuary of organized chaos, a testament to a life spent in the pursuit of truth. Books were stacked on every available surface, forming precarious towers that seemed to defy gravity. The air was thick, with the comforting aroma of aging paper, leather bindings, and the faint, sharp scent of ink from a fountain pen. Albright himself sat behind a massive oak desk, a relic from a bygone era, his face etched with the deep lines of a man who had seen the ugly underbelly of the world and had chosen to expose it rather than look away. He regarded Ilara over the rim of his glasses, his eyes sharp and analytical, yet holding a warmth she had not seen in years. He had listened to her story again, this time in person, and the silence that followed was not one of judgment, but of profound contemplation. He saw before him not the timid, grief-stricken student who had been forced to drop out, but a woman forged in the crucible of loss, her intellect now honed into a weapon. He recognized the cold, clear fire in her eyes, the same fire that drove him to spend his nights chasing down corrupt executives and fraudulent supply chains. He knew that what she was proposing was not a simple act of revenge. It was a crusade for a justice that the world rarely offered to people like her. Their initial strategy sessions were not filled with grand pronouncements, but with the quiet, methodical work of laying a foundation. Albright, with his decades of experience, acted as a grounding force, tempering Ilara's raw fury with cold, hard pragmatism. He spread out a series of large whiteboards in his office, and together they began to map the corporate structure of Finch Global Holdings. Ilara's memory, once a source of pain, now became their greatest asset. She recalled names of suppliers, dates of contracts, and financial details her father had discussed at the dinner table, fragments of a past life that were now crucial pieces of a puzzle. They worked late into the night, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a shared, unspoken understanding of the stakes. The world saw Alistair Finch as a philanthropic titan, a celebrated gourmand, and a brilliant investor. Their task was to peel back that carefully constructed facade and reveal the predator beneath. It was a daunting, almost impossible task, like trying to dismantle a mountain with a teaspoon, But as Alara looked at the web of connections they were building on the whiteboard, she felt not fear, but a flicker of something she had long thought dead: hope. The intellectual challenge, the thrill of the hunt, awakened a part of her that had been dormant for years. The first phase of their investigation was a deep dive into the digital archives, a hunt for the ghost of a transaction that Finch had spent millions to bury. They spent weeks sifting through terabytes of public records, SEC filings, old press releases, and archived articles from financial journals. It was grueling, mind-numbing work. Alara's small apartment was transformed into a command center, its walls covered in printouts and sticky notes, her laptop screen a constant, glowing portal into the past. For every promising lead, they hit a dozen dead ends. Finch's lawyers had been thorough, scrubbing the public record of any overt signs of malfeasance. The official narrative of the Vance & Company takeover was a clean, straightforward story of a struggling business being acquired by a larger, more efficient entity. The smear campaign, the market manipulation, it all existed only in the realm of rumor and in the shattered memories of Alara's family. A sense of frustration began to creep in, a cold dread that perhaps Finch was truly untouchable, his crimes so perfectly executed that they had left no trace for the world to see. It was a digital fortress, and they were on the outside, looking for a crack in its impenetrable walls. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place, not in a complex financial document, but in a series of old import manifests Alara had managed to unearth from a shipping database. It was her unique, specialized knowledge that allowed her to see what a traditional financial investigator would have missed. She noticed a pattern of discrepancies in the records for a specific, high-value ingredient: wild Votsa pepper from Madagascar. Vance & Company had been one of the few ethical importers of the spice, with exclusive contracts. The manifests showed that just weeks before the takeover, a shell corporation, later traced back to Finch Global, had begun flooding the market with a lower-grade, nearly identical pepper, deliberately mislabeled to undercut her family's prices and create the illusion of a supply chain failure. It was a subtle, brilliant act of sabotage, a crime hidden not in numbers but in the nuanced world of gastronomy. To anyone else, it was a minor shipping detail. To Alara, it was the first tangible thread of the conspiracy, the first piece of hard evidence that the official story was a lie. It was proof that the attack on her family had been premeditated, targeted, and executed, with a level of culinary sophistication that pointed directly to a man who prided himself on his palate. Armed with this new information, Professor Albright began to work his network of contacts, the shadowy web of sources he had cultivated over a lifetime of investigative journalism. He made quiet calls to former food critics, disgruntled chefs, and retired industry executives, speaking in the coded language of those who trade in secrets. He was searching for a name, for a person on the inside of Finch Global during that specific time period, someone who might have seen something, someone who might have a conscience. The name he eventually found was Michael Corrigan, a junior accountant who had been abruptly let go with a generous severance package and a non-disclosure agreement thicker than a phone book, just weeks after the Vance & Company acquisition was finalized. Corrigan had since disappeared from the financial world, now running a small, quiet bookstore in a sleepy town in upstate New York. He was their potential insider, the man who might hold the key, but getting him to talk would be like trying to coax a confession from a ghost. He had been paid handsomely for his silence, and breaking it could mean financial ruin and legal retribution from a man who never lost. The meeting with Michael Corrigan took place in a small, anonymous diner halfway between the city and his quiet new life. He was a man haunted by his past, his eyes constantly darting towards the door, his hands trembling as he clutched a coffee cup. He was pale and thin, a shadow of the ambitious young accountant he had once been. At first, he refused to speak, his fear of Alistair Finch a palpable force field around him. He spoke of the NDA, of the lawyers, of the life he had managed to build from the ashes of his career. He saw Alara and Albright not as allies, but as a threat, people who had come to drag him back into the world he had fought so hard to escape. He was a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own, bought and paid for by Finch's money. Ilara watched him, her heart aching with a strange mixture of pity and frustration. She saw in his fear a reflection of her own family's powerlessness, another life bent and broken by the gravitational pull of Finch's greed. She knew that a direct appeal to his conscience would fail against the sheer weight of his terror. She had to find another way in. Instead of pressing him for details about the takeover, Ilara changed her approach. She began to speak about her father. She didn't talk about the finances or the business. She spoke of the man himself, of his passion for sourcing ethical ingredients, of the pride he took in knowing the names of the farmers who grew his spices. She described the wild Votsi pepper, not as a line item on a manifest, but as a story, a connection between a family in Madagascar and a chef in New York. She painted a vivid picture of the world Finch had destroyed, a world built on integrity and human connection. Her words were not an accusation, they were a eulogy. As she spoke, she saw a flicker of something in Corrigan's eyes. A memory, a ghost of the young, idealistic man he had been before Finch Global had hollowed him out. He had been one of the people who processed the invoices for those very spices, a small cog in a machine he hadn't fully understood at the time. She had reminded him that the numbers he had helped manipulate were not just abstract figures. They were the lifeblood of a good man, the legacy of a proud family. The dam of Corrigan's fear finally broke. With a shaky voice, he confessed. He told them he had always known something was wrong. He spoke of a secret server, physically separate from the main network, a digital black site known internally as the Pantry. It was where Finch's most ruthless strategists kept the real records of their corporate raids, the unedited emails, the original financial models showing the true value of the companies they were targeting, the plans for market manipulation. It was Finch's playbook, his diary of crimes, all stored on a server that was a ghost in the system, its existence known only to a handful of his most trusted lieutenants. Corrigan had never had access, but he knew the name of the boutique IT security firm that had set it up, a small, exclusive company called Argent Security Solutions. He didn't have passwords or access codes, but he gave them something just as valuable, a starting point, a name, and a target. The fortress had a hidden door, and they finally knew where to look for the key. Argent Security Solutions was a fortress in its own right, a company that prided itself on being as invisible and impenetrable as the data it protected. A direct assault was impossible, but Ilara had an idea, a long shot born from her unique understanding of their adversary. Alistair Finch was a creature of habit and monumental ego. She knew from her time at Aura that he was pathologically obsessed with a particular brand of rare, single-estate coffee from a specific mountain in Jamaica, a coffee so exclusive it was sold by private auction. She also knew that Argent's CEO, a man named Julian Croft, was a sycophantic admirer of Finch, desperately trying to curry favor to secure a larger contract. Her plan was audacious and relied on a perfect execution of social engineering. She would not try to break into the system with code. She would walk in through the front door, disguised as a purveyor of the one thing she knew both men coveted, using their own snobbery and greed as the key. The transformation was remarkable. With Albright's help, she secured a small amount of the rare Jamaican coffee through one of his contacts in the import world. She created a fictional company, Blue Mountain Curated, complete with a professional website and beautifully printed business cards. She shed the identity of Ilara Vance, line cook, and adopted the persona of Lena, a confident, knowledgeable coffee broker. She dressed in a simple but elegant business suit, her hair pulled back in a severe, professional style. She practiced her pitch for hours, memorizing the flavor profiles, the harvesting techniques, the entire history of the coffee estate. She was using her gastronomic knowledge not as a defense, but as a weapon of infiltration. She was building a character so believable, so perfectly tailored to the desires of her targets, that they would never think to question her motives. It was a terrifying performance, a high-wire act with no safety net, where one wrong word, one flicker of uncertainty, could bring the entire plan crashing down. The call to Julian Croft's office was surprisingly easy to secure. The moment she mentioned Alistair Finch's name and the exclusive coffee, she was fast-tracked through his gatekeepers. She arrived at the sleek, minimalist offices of Argent Security, a box of the precious coffee beans in a custom-made wooden case held carefully in her hands. The air inside was cold and sterile, the silence broken only by the quiet hum of servers. Croft was a man who mirrored his environment, polished, cold, and impeccably dressed. He was immediately captivated by the coffee, his eyes lighting up with the avarice of a collector. As Alara began her presentation, she moved the conversation from the coffee itself to the importance of proper storage and climate control for such a valuable organic product, a topic she knew would resonate with a man obsessed with security and control. She spoke of humidity, temperature, and data logging, seamlessly weaving the language of gastronomy with the language of IT. Her objective was a single, unguarded moment. While Croft was distracted, examining the coffee beans with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, she casually mentioned that she had a proprietary data logger application on a USB drive that could help him monitor the conditions in his own office pantry to ensure the coffee's integrity. She framed it as a complimentary gift, a small token to a potential client. His greed and his desire to impress Finch overrode any security protocols he might have had. He saw not a threat, but an opportunity to indulge his hobby and further his business interests. With a dismissive wave, he gestured to a spare terminal in the corner of his office, telling her she could plug it in there. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it, but her hands were perfectly steady as she walked to the computer, her back to him. The USB drive did not contain a data logger. It contained a sophisticated piece of software, designed by a cybersecurity expert Albright knew, that would silently map the internal network and search for the hidden server Corrigan had called the pantry. She had only a few minutes. As the software ran silently in the background, she continued her performance, engaging Croft in a detailed conversation about the ethics of coffee sourcing, a topic she knew would appeal to his feigned sense of corporate responsibility. She was playing his game, speaking his language, mirroring his values, all while a digital thief was creeping through the hallways of his secure network. Every second felt like an hour. The progress bar on the hidden application on her drive was moving with agonizing slowness. She could feel Croft's attention beginning to wane, his impatience growing. Just as he was about to turn his attention back to her and the terminal, a small, discreet notification popped up on her screen. Network mapped. Target server located. Data packet ready for transfer. With a final flourish of conversation about presenting the coffee to Mr. Finch, she smoothly removed the drive, thanked Croft for his time, and walked out of the office, the digital keys to Alistair Finch's secret kingdom now in her possession. Back in the safety of her apartment, the air crackled with a nervous, triumphant energy. Albright watched, his expression a mixture of awe and terror at the risk she had taken, as Alara inserted the USB drive into her laptop. The data packet began to download, a stream of encrypted files flowing from Finch's hidden server onto her hard drive. It took hours to decrypt, but when the first files opened, they both knew they had it. It was all there, laid bare in cold, black and white text. Emails from Finch explicitly ordering his team to crush the Vance brand by creating a, quote, market panic. Spreadsheets detailing the deliberate short-selling of their stock, timed to coincide with the false rumors they were planting in the media. Memos outlining the plan to acquire the company for pennies on the dollar once it was financially crippled. It was a cold, sociopathic blueprint for the complete and utter destruction of her family. The numbers on the screen were not just financial data, they were a record of every sleepless night her father had endured, every tear her mother had shed, every dream Alara had been forced to sacrifice. The smoking gun was a single audio file, buried deep within a compressed folder. It was a recording of a conference call, dated 3 days before the final takeover offer. Alistair Finch's voice was unmistakable, laced with the same arrogant confidence she had heard in the restaurant. In the recording, he was laughing. He was laughing as he described how the stress of the financial pressure was likely to break her father, whom he referred to as a sentimental old fool. He joked that they would be doing him a favor by taking the company off his hands. He spoke of their family not as business rivals, but as insects to be crushed under his heel, their life's work nothing more than a stepping stone on his path to greater wealth. Hearing that laugh, that casual, cruel dismissal of her father's life and suffering, was the final blow. The last vestiges of Ilara's grief and fear were burned away, cauterized by a white-hot, righteous fury. This was no longer just about justice for her family. It was about exposing a monster who believed he was so far above the rest of humanity that he could destroy lives for sport and never face the consequences. With the irrefutable proof in their hands, the final stage of the plan began to take shape. Going to the SEC or the media was an option, but it was a slow, uncertain path. The legal battle could take years, and Finch had an army of lawyers who could tie it up in court until Ilara was bankrupt and broken. They needed something more immediate, more definitive. They needed to destroy his reputation as completely and as publicly as he had destroyed her family's. Justice for Ilara required not just a legal victory, but a moral one. She wanted the world to see him for what he was, stripped of his philanthropic facade. They needed a stage, a moment when he was at the absolute peak of his power and arrogance, a moment when the whole world was watching him, admiring him, a moment when his fall would be the most spectacular, the most devastating, and the most deserved. The opportunity presented itself on the front page of the New York Times Society section. An announcement for the annual Finch Foundation Gastronomy Gala, a lavish, multi-million-dollar charity event that was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar. This year's gala was set to be the biggest yet. The headline read that Alistair Finch himself would be the guest of honor, receiving the foundation's first-ever Ethical Business Leadership Award for his supposed contributions to sustainable and ethical food sourcing. The irony was so profound, so sickening, that it was almost poetic. It was the perfect stage. He would be celebrating his own virtue, basking in the applause of the very industry he had corrupted, accepting an award for the very principles he had systematically violated. It was the ultimate act of hubris, and it would be the setting for his downfall. The checkmate was in sight. Ilara looked at the glossy announcement, a picture of Alistair Finch smiling benevolently at the camera printed beside the text. The man in the photograph was a celebrated hero, a pillar of the community. But she knew the truth. She held the evidence that would unmask him, that would turn his moment of ultimate triumph into a public execution of his character. Her plan was no longer about simple revenge. It was about reclaiming the truth. She would not let him rewrite history with his blood money. With Professor Albright's help, she began to formulate the final, intricate steps of their plan. She would not be a guest at the gala. She would not be an observer. She would be a part of the machinery, securing a position on the catering staff for the event, a ghost in the machine once more, but this time she would be the one pulling the strings. She would stand on his stage, in his temple, and she would burn it all to the ground with the one thing he could not buy, bully or bury, the truth. The line cook he had dismissed was about to serve him his just desserts, and it would be a dish served cold, in front of the entire world. The grand ballroom of the New York Plaza Hotel was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of diamonds and champagne. The air was a delicate tapestry woven from the scents of 1,000 blooming orchids, the subtle perfume of the city's elite, and the rich, decadent aroma of the 5-course meal being served. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music a gentle, unobtrusive soundtrack to the quiet murmur of billion-dollar conversations. Light from chandeliers the size of small automobiles splintered into 1,000,000 fractured rainbows, dancing across silk gowns and the polished faces of men who moved markets with a single phone call. This was the Finch Foundation Gastronomy Gala, the absolute apex of Alistair Finch's self-constructed myth. Here, he was not just a businessman, he was a king, a patron saint of the culinary arts, and tonight, he was to be canonized. And amidst the legion of servers in crisp black and white uniforms, moving like silent shadows through the glittering constellations of guests, was Alara Vance. She was a ghost in the machine once more, her face a mask of professional neutrality, but her heart was a cold, steady metronome, counting down the final seconds of Alistair Finch's reign. She moved with a purpose that was invisible to everyone around her. As she cleared plates and refilled water glasses, her eyes were scanning, mapping, and analyzing. She saw the placement of the cameras for the live media feed, the location of the main projection screen behind the grand stage, the subtle movements of the event's technical crew. Inside her, the white-hot rage had been transmuted into something far more dangerous. A crystalline, unbreakable calm. Every nerve ending was alive, every sense heightened. She could feel the subtle vibration of the floor as people walked by. She could hear the specific clink of a fork dropped 2 tables away. She could see the faint sheen of sweat on the brow of a nervous CEO trying to get Finch's attention. Her mind was a supercomputer, processing terabytes of sensory data, all while her internal monologue was a silent, steady recitation of her father's story. With every cloying compliment she overheard about Finch's generosity, the image of her father's vacant eyes in the sterile hospital room grew sharper, clearer, fueling the righteous fire that had now consumed every last ounce of her fear. She was not here to serve, she was here to pass judgment. The moment arrived with a flourish of trumpets and a wave of polite, enthusiastic applause. Alistair Finch, looking regal and benevolent in a bespoke tuxedo, ascended the stage to accept the Foundation's first-ever Ethical Business Leadership Award. He approached the podium, bathed in the warm, forgiving glow of a spotlight, and smiled a smile that was practiced, polished, and utterly false. He began his speech, his voice smooth and resonant, filling the vast ballroom with perfectly crafted lies. He spoke of integrity, of transparency, of the sacred duty of the powerful to uplift the small, artisanal producers of the world. He spoke of Vance and Company. Provisions, not by name but by archetype, praising the little guys and lamenting how so many of them couldn't compete in the modern market. As he spoke, Alara was already moving. She slipped away from her station, her path taking her through a service corridor and up a short flight of stairs that led to the small, darkened tech booth overlooking the stage. The technician, a young man engrossed in the live feed, barely noticed her as she quietly plugged a small, unmarked USB drive into a port on the main control board. The stage was his, but the screen was now hers. Finch was reaching the crescendo of his speech, his hand placed theatrically over his heart. He spoke of leaving a legacy, of building a better, more honorable world for the next generation. It was at that precise moment that Alara, back on the main floor, began her long walk toward the stage. She did not run. She walked with a slow, deliberate pace that drew the eye. A few heads turned, then a few more. A ripple of confusion spread through the front rows. Finch, blinded by the spotlight and his own ego, didn't see her until she was at the foot of the stage. His practiced smile faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. Security guards started to move, but they were too slow. Alara ascended the steps, her simple black catering uniform a stark, shocking intrusion into the perfect, glittering tableau. She walked directly to the podium, took the secondary microphone, and looked out at the sea of stunned, silent faces. Then she looked at Alistair Finch, whose face was now a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. His world was about to end, and he had no idea how completely she had cornered him. Her voice when she spoke was not loud or angry. It was quiet, clear, and carried the devastating weight of absolute truth. She said his name, and then she said her father's name. As she spoke, the massive screen behind Finch flickered to life. His smiling, philanthropic face was replaced by the cold, hard text of an email. His own words, projected 10 feet high for the entire world to see. Crush the Vance brand. Create a market panic. We'll acquire the assets for pennies on the dollar. A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, sucked the air from the room. Another image flashed onto the screen. the falsified shipping manifests of the Votsa Pepper, showing the deliberate sabotage. Then came the internal financial models, proving Finch Global knew the true, healthy value of her family's company even as they publicly declared it a failing business. One by one she presented the pieces of her father's ruin, her voice providing the calm, factual narration to the story of Finch's sociopathic greed. He stood frozen, a statue of impotent rage, exposed and humiliated in a way that made their encounter at the restaurant seem like a pleasantry. The final piece of evidence was not a document, but a sound. Alara held the microphone up to her phone, and a moment of silence was followed by the unmistakable sound of Alistair Finch's voice, captured on that conference call years ago. The sound of his laughter filled the grand ballroom, a cold, cruel, echoing sound as he mocked the sentimental old fool whose life he was in the process of destroying. The laughter was a moral contagion, poisoning the air, turning every admiring gaze in the room into one of horrified disgust. That sound did what no document could. It revealed the withered, rotten soul of the man on the stage. The downfall was instantaneous and absolute. The silence was broken by the sound of 100 phones being raised, their screens lighting up the darkened room as people began to record. Esteemed guests, men and women who had been shaking his hand minutes before, now rose from their seats and began walking out, their faces set in grim, stony masks. His empire, built on a foundation of lies, was dissolving in real time, washed away by a tide of truth he could not stop. He looked at Alara, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and a dawning, terrifying understanding. He had not just been beaten, he had been erased. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. What was the most satisfying moment of Alistair Finch's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. In the weeks that followed, the world that had once celebrated Alistair Finch turned on him with a ferocity reserved for the truly condemned. The SEC launched a massive investigation, freezing his assets and unraveling decades of predatory practices. Lawsuits, from families like Alara's and from shareholders he had defrauded, piled up until they formed a mountain of litigation from which he would never emerge. His name, once a symbol of success, became a byword for corporate evil, but Alara did not watch his slow public immolation. She was busy building. One afternoon, while sketching out plans in a small coffee shop, a man approached her table. It was the nervous associate who had been with Finch at Aura that first night. He introduced himself as Arthur Chen, a rival investor who had been considering a partnership with Finch. He told her that what he had witnessed in the restaurant, and later at the gala, had not only disgusted him but had also shown him a path to a better way of doing business. He had seen her intellect, her integrity and her courage. He didn't offer her a job, he offered her a future. He proposed to provide the capital, millions of dollars, to not just resurrect Vance & Company provisions, but to build a new, global food sourcing conglomerate with her, the prodigy he had seen in action, as its founding CEO. The new headquarters of Vance & Company, Global, was nothing like the cold, sterile towers where men like Finch conducted their business. It was a bright, open space in Brooklyn, with a rooftop garden and a state-of-the-art test kitchen that served as the building's heart. Alara, now dressed not in a cook's uniform but in the sharp, confident attire of a CEO, moved through the space with a sense of purpose that radiated to everyone around her. She was not just a boss, she was a mentor, a leader who knew the names of the farmers they worked with, who could still identify the terroir of an olive oil by taste, who used her profound knowledge not as a weapon, but as a tool to build a company founded on the very principles of ethics and quality her father had cherished. She had not only reclaimed her family's name, she had elevated it, transforming their legacy of loss into a global symbol of integrity. On the wall of her office, there was only one picture: her parents, on the day they first opened their small shop, their faces full of hope and pride. It was a promise she had kept. Her journey had come full circle, but she had arrived at a destination far beyond her wildest dreams. She had found justice for her father, not in a courtroom, but in the world she was now building. She had taken the worst of her pain and the best of her talent and forged a new life, one defined not by what had been taken from her, but by what she chose to create. Her story became a quiet legend in the industry, a reminder that true power is not the ability to crush others, but the courage to speak the truth, even when your voice shakes. She had walked through the fire of humiliation and loss, and emerged not burned, but purified, her purpose clear, and her resolve unbreakable. The line cook who had been dismissed as invisible had become an architect of a better, more honorable world, proving that a single voice, armed with the truth, can indeed be mightier than an empire. If Alara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you believe that courage and truth can change the world, help us spread that message by giving this video a like and sending it to a friend. To make sure you don't miss our next story of righteous revenge, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell.